Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's episode of the World Discord podcast. We're going to be talking about Yemen today. I'm your host, Brian Endless.
And I'm your other host, Joel Ostrow.
Thanks, Joel. Joel will be introducing our expert guest for today in just a moment, but I thought I'd do a little bit of background, just a big picture stuff on Yemen to set the tone for everything. Yemen is an ancient state in the Middle East. It was one of the places that trade from Europe to the East went through for millennia, but it's actually a relatively new state, and the current crisis is relatively new. Southern Yemen, Communist Yemen, and North Yemen merged in the 1990s after years of strife. The current political crisis really began in 2011, inspired by the Arab Spring uprisings when the president of Yemen was forced to resign. A civil war broke out, and that brought us to the situation that we sometimes hear about now in the news. A group called the Houthis seized much of the north and west. This is well known as an Iranian-backed group, while Saudi Arabian forces then intervened to support the internationally recognized government in the southern part of the country. Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State have both been involved. And in the last several years, Aden, the capital, was seized by the separatist group backed by the United Arab Emirates, and the government was forced to move to Saudi Arabia. There's been a terrible human cost to this crisis, more than 150,000 dead, and one of the world's worst humanitarian crises. Estimates are that over 23 million people, about 3/4 of the population, are in need of some form of aid. International news typically calls Yemen the Wild West. There's very little governance and just an enormous amount of conflict. I think I'll leave it there and turn it over to Joel to introduce our guest, who can really give us a lot more background and detail on the topic. Joel, go for it.
Thanks, Brian. We are joined today by Fatima Abo Alasar. Did I get your name right?
That's right.
Great, thank you. Fatima is a non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute and a senior analyst at the Washington Center for Yemeni Studies. Before that, she's held a number of positions, including at the Kennedy School of Government, where she was a Mason Fellow, and she was an International Policy Fellow at the Open Society Foundation. From 2006 to 2012, she worked as an advisor for the Embassy of Yemen in Washington. And before that, served as a program officer at the Department for International Development in Yemen. So, Fatima, thank you so much for joining us today. I know Brian gave a brief introduction, sort of with all of the episodes on this podcast. Brian and I tend to assume no prior knowledge, but I know for a fact that we're going to have listeners to this episode who really know absolutely nothing about Yemen, including where it's located. So could you give us just a little bit of a history on what Yemen is, how the European colonial powers interacted with it, like what that history might be, and just to set the stage for a discussion of the extended and complex conflict that's happening now?
Thanks, Joel, for the introduction. Brian, it's thank you for having me both on this podcast. In listening about Yemen and just taking that introduction in, and it's just there might be some things that would be better to understand from a first person perspective, right? Like,
Absolutely.
haven't been in Yemen. It's just like it's so dry. You listen to Yemen and you listen about it, and it's dry, and it just sounds like a scary place. Honestly, if my parents weren't originally from Yemen, I don't think I would have had an interest in understanding it or going there or visiting. That's why I've always had so much respect for people from the West and even from the Arab world, who took an interest in went to see Yemen even on vacation. It's a charming country. It's beautiful, diverse. It's twice the size of the UK and one of the oldest civilizations in the world. And Yemenis really take pride of that. And it's has been in an evolving state since its inception. So an evolving political state, and it has been extremely tribal to its core. And I think that's part of the mystery about it, is the tribal communities. And the tribal communities is also like not what we expect. It's more of like a clan structure. It's kind of like maybe Scottish clan up in Europe. But so it's not our idea of just like tribes armed to the teeth and fighting with each other. Although you know they have power. They would fight if their rights are violated. If uh, they have their own governance system. And as you've mentioned, the Houthis, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, the southern separatists, etc., and all that talks to a really complicated
Yeah.
Yemeni dynamic and history. Um, so the one thing I usually tell people who don't know much about Yemen is that you're pretty much with everybody else. Not a lot of people, including Yemenis, might even know the depth of its history and diversity. For almost a millennia, Yemen was, and the northern parts of Yemen, there's definitely a difference between the north and the south. So the northern is more on the highlands, has a very mountainous terrain. The southern is usually coastal. And I think that has kind of shaped two different culture up in north and south. And also, they've been two different countries, north and south, until unification in 1990. But when we talk about the North has its very strong history and has been for 1,000 year, ruled by some kind of a theological dynasty, and it was called, just the imamates. Uh, Religious imamates ruled the north of Yemen. Mutawakkilat kingdom was the last of the kingdoms that controlled Yemen. And it was an era that was marked by um, or for the majority of the northern Yemenis, it was kind of maybe an era of stability, but also tradition. They also Yemenis had a sect that developed almost entirely in that area and in that region in Yemen, and that sect was the Zaydi sect. Zaydi is neither seen as Sunni, neither seen as Shia, which is the two big sects in Islam. So it was somewhere on the border of these two. Sunnis viewed them on the border of Shia, and Shia viewed them on the border of Sunni, and they just came up with their own tradition. Um, and it also was maybe somewhat classist in the way that they've governed. And again, like maybe the thing I would compare to is medieval Europe in the past, right, where you've had like a certain king that people thought was ordained by a higher power. And same with the Imamate kingdom, they believed that they were uh, ordained by Allah to govern over this. And especially this privilege was just the privilege of the few who had a lineage that traced back to Prophet Muhammad.
Now, being next to Saudi Arabia, was it part of various Arab Muslim empires through the 1800s, or was it independent at part of that time or all of that time?
It was kind of, I mean, definitely independent. Yemen was known as Yemen before Saudi Arabia came to have Al Saud, right? So it was independent, but it was not as rich, did not have many connections, whereby Al Saud developed strong connections and ties with the West that allowed them to dig deeper and find the oil. Which led to Saudi Arabia being where it is. Northern Yemen was closed off. So they never had that. And in fact, despite the fact that Saudi Arabia was a Sunni country, different sect than the Zaydi, they still had a good pact between the monarchs. Monarchs respected each other, and they worked to protect each other. Um, and this has been kind of troubling because in the 1960s, that's where the northern Yemeni revolution happened against the Zaydi imamates, whereby they felt that they were not respected as citizens. They wanted their rights. Like they saw all of the other countries in the Arab world were on the path to progress and prosperity, while Yemen was really being closed off in this class system, and people were not given access to education, and myth making was really big in these parts. So a group of revolutionaries overthrew the imamate, and Yemen in the north at least became the Yemen Arab Republic. Um, this was new, and this is probably a little bit confusing, but Saudi Arabia supported the monarchs, not the revolutionaries. So Saudi Arabia supported the Zaydi monarchs because they had a pact with them, which is kind of the opposite to what's happening right now. So
Yeah,
this is
it's so
where
confusing,
I
right?
know.
So for many years, I led a grant through the State Department that brought students from the MENA, Middle East, North Africa region to our campus in the summer. And we had probably the most cohesive um, cohort that we had. Uh, I think succeeded so much because of a young man from Yemen, and he just a great guy. I'm sure Alamudi is listening to this episode, um, and he was uh, very much a humorous, kind, just fun spirit who was very much maybe somewhat tongue in cheek, but very much an advocate for South Yemen. South Yemen baby was like the cry of that group all summer. And I asked him at one point because the conflict was flared up pretty badly. Then this was like 2013 in the summer, because I couldn't sort it out for myself. Usually, when there's a conflict, and certainly the ones that Brian and I have covered in this podcast so far, um, there's someone that we Americans at least can identify as the good guys. Or if they're all bad, at least these are less bad, and the preferred outcome would favor this group. And I would ask Alamudi, Mo, who are the good guys here? And his answer with a big smile and a laugh was always, none of them. They're all, and I won't finish his with the sentence. So all that tells me is that it's jumbled, and the external supporters of the various groups are not necessarily who you would predict. Can you just really, in a cursory way, sketch out who's the government, who do the Saudis support and why, who do the Iranians support and why, and what are the other major groups, and what are they fighting for?
um, Right. There are, and I think it's probably important to not view Yemen from or like anywhere from like binary perspectives of good
Yeah,
and bad often would lay a trap for you.
yeah.
And who needs to be supported and what. It just, the situation is continuously evolving, and that's what we've seen. And um, there are no fixed positions here. And I
Mm,
think that's what makes Yemen complicated. But also, like, if you ask people in the United States who's good and bad, like even in your own, neighborhood, it's a polarizing
Fair point.
question, and it's really difficult to get to. But if I think, talking about what has happened in Yemen, and I think what brings us here is, as Brian mentioned before, it's 2011 onwards, after the Arab Spring, because for 13 years on Yemen's history, they had one president, and it was just predictable. And and in these 30 years, you knew what the powers were. The General People's Congress was the president party, and it kind of dominated. Ali Abdullah Saleh dominated the news. Everything was about him, good and bad. So to go from there, 2011 just changed everything. There were aspirations for democracy. It's what people wanted. And Yemen had changed in its revolutionary process. So although Ali Abdullah Saleh was perceived in the West, I'm not going to say in the Middle East, as a dictator, in the among his people, he was kind of seen as the benevolent dictator. So you could kind of challenge him if you wanted to. Often he bribed people who challenged him, which made him, maybe more desirable than others that punished them.
Now,
So,
now, just to clarify for a minute, when he was overthrown or forced to resign, weren't there a lot of allegations of human rights abuses that went with that too?
um, that's an interesting question. I can't quite remember. I mean, there were human rights abuses, but not to the scale and the magnitude that we see today.
Okay.
And I will. Here's a telling sign. In 2011, people were on the street protesting, and the biggest massacre was somewhere in March 2011, where about kind of 50 of the revolutionaries were shot. He denied it. But that was the biggest massacre, and people said they will never forget. The same people who protested Ali Abdullah Saleh were praying for him to come back in 2017, and they mourned his death. They thought that whatever version that was there was much better than what it is, which is kind of like, I mean, it was better the devil you know, and we saw the international community and people at the State Department and others just like thinking, what is happening?
Right.
Like, because the sentiment against him was so strong, but then the alternative was extremely bad,
So,
extremely bad.
what are those alternatives?
Well, what happened was, and I think what happened was the rise of the Houthis. 2014 was a calamity. Um, the Houthis were this group that it comes from a Zaydi sect. It comes from this lineage that I talked about. I mean, this is why the history is so important. They come from the sect that have always felt that they were marginalized because they had once ruled Yemen. Part of the Zaydi Imamate actually took refuge in Saudi Arabia after the war because the revolutionaries took over back in the 60s. So throughout these decades, this certain group felt somewhat disenfranchised, felt that their Zaydi faith was also being somewhat muddled by Sunni um, Wahhabism that trickled down from Saudi Arabia, and they felt that they need to be the preservers of their faith. So it started as a religious movement. It was the believing youth is what they call themselves. Hussein Badruddin al-Houthi was the person who helped establish that. He also became a member of parliament after Yemen's unification and
Hmm.
had his own party. But there
Hmm.
was, I think he wanted to become a power like Hezbollah. He
Mm.
tried to find assistance from Iran, and I think at that time Iran was exploring assisting him, but did not have faith in his political party. Um, so in 2004, his group intercepted a presidential motorcade in the around Sada and then where they are. gunfire was exchanged, and ultimately Hussein Badruddin al-Houthi was killed. You didn't really hear much of it. That was just
Yeah.
a footnote in the news, really.
Hmm.
Just a tribal skirmish up there. But because of the backing, the believing youth base that he had, which was few thousand, not more than that, and because of support from Iran, although it was somewhat limited, um, uh, conflict and direct clashes happened between government forces and Houthis, and it continued to happen. It continued to escalate. It escalated over the period of 10 years, 6 rounds of war, all of them more complicated and more sophisticated, and the Houthis' power grew throughout these 6 wars. Now, in 2011, and after Ali Abdullah Saleh stepped down, and because of the country has heard of what happened in the north of Yemen, also the country sympathized with the Houthis, who fought this, you know, kind of perceived person who's been in power for 30 years. So they saw them as and I have to be. They saw them as a group that was also affected by Saleh's governance.
Sure.
Um, in the same way, they also acknowledged the grievances that Southerners have had in the South because of the rushed unification that had happened, and naively thought that a political process would be sufficient in addressing this by acknowledging the grievances that happened in these two regions, in the South and the North. Then you can work with these people to create a version of Yemen that will encompass all. That was not the case. So, although there was something called the National Dialogue Conference, it was internationally backed, UN backed, European and American. It produced a really beautiful constitution on paper. Um, everyone read, like, the main powers be, which are the powers that held the guns on the ground, looked at that and just smirked at it.
Yeah.
Thought, yes, we were party to this. It doesn't necessarily mean that we need to sign off on it. So that was one thing. At the same time, there was this decision to disband Yemen's army in
Hmm.
2000, because who did the army belong to? Just
Hmm.
former Ali Abdullah Saleh. People were scared. And in the background, I did mention that Hussein Badruddin al-Houthi died fighting, basically in this skirmishes with Ali Abdullah Saleh. Well, his group ended up allying with Ali Abdullah Saleh,
Hmm.
which was so confusing, and it was something that I think even the intelligence community did not understand in time.
It's still
Um,
confusing.
it,
it,
it could be
honestly,
confusing. Yes, and I do understand that, but at the time when the alliance was forming, and it was basically an alliance for power.
right?
What you wanted was power, and the alliances shift. They're not written in stone. Um,
Yeah.
so this alliance happened that allowed Ali Abdullah Saleh to come back in a brief alliance with the Houthis for 3 years between 2014 to 2017. And in that, I think Yemen's real crisis began. You mentioned in your introduction that there was a civil war after the Houthis took over. It's not in the way that you would think. They just basically marched. I mean, they took the capital. Period. They
Okay.
were just there overnight. You didn't have to fight a war to take a capital. All they had to do was just put the members of the cabinet under house arrest, and that's what they did, including the interim president, Abdurrabbu Mansour Hadi. What happened then is that the interim president left to the south of Yemen. He miraculously escaped, and his members of the cabinets were asked to switch allegiance or have it with the Houthis. Some of them had worked with the General People's Congress before, so it seemed like it was just a rotating chairs at that point. It wasn't something that really alerted everybody. And it was just unfortunate. So as when there was the GPC, the General People's Congress, and the Houthis, the threat was kind of underestimated, from Yemenis, from international observers, because they've long seen conflict, they've long seen Yemenis come out of it. So it didn't seem like it was a big deal. But it was a big deal for the Yemenis, the revolutionaries who lost their lives, who were imprisoned, who were tortured by the Houthis. The situation from a human rights perspective continued to deteriorate, including 4 members of the GPC themselves, who found themselves not an equal party in this alliance, and the Houthis really rising with the power of their guns.
I'm sorry, is it too simplistic? So Iran still backs the Houthis, right?
Iran still backs the
And Saudi
Houthis.
Arabia backs the nominal government. Is that right?
Well, when Abdurrabba Mansour Hadi escaped to the south, fighting ensued in a way that Houthis and Saleh forces took over the south, really. So there was fighting. Yemen was becoming under the grip of these two entities. And Abdurrabba Mansour Hadi requested from the Saudis and others to help interfere and end this mess. And there was a UN Security Council resolution um, that kind of stopped the arm to basically stop the armament of the Houthis. So the Saudis have interfered to kind of return things as they were. The Saudis and the Gulf have played a critical role in the National Dialogue Conference, in the mediation from 2011 after the Arab Spring. So they were party to that, and I think they were looked at as enforcers of that peace.
Yeah, the reason I asked is it too simplistic to just to view the current conflict as a proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran, or is that part of what's going on?
Let me add to that and ask that a little bit differently too. Is this, what are the Saudi interests here? Is this
Yeah,
proxy war interest? Is this supporting a friendly government interest? Is there something else going on here?
and what are Iran's interests too?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's all of the above for Saudi. So, yes, it would be supporting a friendly government and also stopping the formation of an army that would look like Hezbollah in
Mm.
Lebanon. So, the Houthis were that. And the more that the Saudis spoke about that, the more that people just ridiculed them because they couldn't really see how Iran was supporting the Houthis. So, there was evidence, but it was so difficult to obtain because, um, in a sense, it's kind of like fighting a mafia, right? Like even here in the United States, like so you know that there is an underground, you know that they're being supported, you know that there are like certain maybe families or money that's going to support them. You can't really trace that without having strong evidence, and for some reason, the international community wanted that strong evidence. So when the Houthis and Iran said, "Oh no, we're not backing each other's, we're just friends," uh, everyone said, "Oh, okay, they're just friends."
Mm.
So there was this naivety, and especially in the press. And there were, so as an Arabic speaker, as someone who lived in Yemen and understands the politics and study uh, critically, there was evidence of Iran supporting Yemen and Houthis back from the 80s. There were evidence of Hussein Badruddin Houthi going to Qom and studying in Iran and being influenced by 79, and wanting to emulate that after, the perceived loss of the status. Again, like history plays a very important role. So that was there. What I understand currently is that Iran did not necessarily believe um, in their party that was formed in the 90s, but they believed in the movement and they supported the movement. And I think the Houthis were too eager to say, we can do this. So the Houthis proved themselves as a worthy adversary and ally and someone who's worthy of funding. And I think that, there is a mutual benefit here. For a very long time, there was this futile argument whether the Houthis are proxies or not. They are proxy, and it's not mutually exclusive. Like just because just because it's proxy doesn't necessarily lessen from the fact that they had
No,
what
no, I didn't mean that
Right.
imply that.
no, I know it's not you, but like
Yeah,
I'm just saying
yeah.
it doesn't reduce from the fact that they have perceived legitimate right and grievances and are the ones who were ready to carry this forward. So, and I think that's something that the international community does not. They still see the Houthis as an autonomous group, but there has been evidence of the contrary every step of the way, and we can talk about that later. But like the simplest thing would be, for example, the attacks on Saudi Arabia's oil installations back in 2011. Houthis claimed it when it wasn't them. When our
Mm.
intelligence uncovered, it wasn't them. It originated from Iraq. So they were working as parts of the axis of resistance. Um, Back then, they denied their role with the axis of resistance. Right now, they are the most fundamental member of that.
And
And
when you say axis of resistance, what is that?
the Axis of Resistance is an alliance of the Shia transnational military alliance that Iran created, Islamic Republic of Iran, that has, the Hashd al-Shabi in Iraq, it has Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, uh, Palestinian factions. It is a it is a resistance group against imperialist Western and quote unquote Zionist uh, influence in the region. And I think fundamentally, I mean, if we go to the Houthi slogan, and this slogan was cultivated after the visits of Hussein Badruddin al-Houthi to Qom. It is death to America, death to Israel, curse upon the Jews, and victory to Islam. Um, they eh, Analysts saw them as something that came as a Yemeni slogan, but uh, isn't that too
Sounds
close?
Iranian. Yeah,
Isn't that too close to
yeah,
Islamic Republic's propaganda?
Yeah.
yeah.
So there was, when Houthis in 2011 said that they protested corruption. Um, it's not just economic corruption that they were talking about. They were talking
Right.
about political corruption. And for them, political corruption is being friends and having normal relations with the United States and Israel. And that's unfortunate. So the Houthis are, kind of much like the Taliban. They have risen from obscurity in Yemen, and now they are the dominant force. Um,
When you
so
say that, excuse me, dominant force in terms of political power or in terms of sort of popularity among the regular Yemeni population? I was going to ask, like, what's sort of the balance of support, absence the arms, like just sort of what's the word I'm looking for? Just popular support among the people.
Yeah.
Is
Are
it
any of
even
these
measurable?
military groups really popular?
There's
And
a
then on the other
better
side too, do any of these groups actually work for the people, or are they just
right,
working for their own power?
right.
I can never know. I can
Hmm.
never really know.
Oh, that's my
I
friend's position too. It's
I
interesting.
feel like it's too so what I know is the voices of dissent. I know that people have left, and I know that
Hmm.
the humanitarian situation is too big, and I know that the freedoms that once were are no more. So the situation is changing for someone who was born in 2000, 10, 11. It's completely different than someone who was born before. So they are governing by archaic rules, by systems that are not humane, not democratic. People who are born to it are forced to coexist. I think if they know of a better way, they would choose that. They're advocate. Um, they're not aligned. They're not their adversaries complain about them. So anybody who's a GPC member, anyone who's from the Islah Party, from the south, they've committed egregious violations in the south of Yemen. So they, and the Saudi and Emirati intervention had helped push them out of there. So there are liberated areas. People don't want to see them expand. People under their power want them out. So
Talking about the Houthis.
Definitely. Sorry. Yes, I should
Yeah.
have. I
All
should
right.
have
So,
clarified
so
that.
the Saudis are seen kind of as liberators in that case. Is that, or is that not completely true?
It depends on what side of the map you're on.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But that
So
makes the world upside down and inside out a little, doesn't it, Brian?
Oh yeah,
yes. So
absolutely.
it depends really
Yeah.
on where you are. If you are in the south of Yemen, then yes, they're
Mm.
important faction. If you're in a place like Taiz that was besieged, like sieged by the Houthis, they felt like the intervention did not help them. If you're in Sana'a, and there are airstrikes, you still hate the Houthis, you still don't want them. But if
Mm.
airstrikes are coming to your neighborhood and killing your people, then you're probably are going to be too close to the Houthis than the Saudis. So it really depends. And I think I try to give an honest answer because everybody supports someone in Yemen. Um, and yes, there was support to the Saudis for a very long time, and it's because of a belief that they did liberate the southern areas. They worked with the local population to push the Houthis out of them, and these areas became the safe zones. Ma'rib is so critical.
Yeah.
Um, so there is the Hudaydah was so critical. There was a battle of Hudaydah in 2018, and I think this is something so important to talk about in this podcast. 2017, President Ali Abdullah Saleh was killed in December. Um, and then, his relatives, his nephew, Tariq Saleh, um, vowed to, avenge him. And a big battle was prepared. There was an alliance between the Southerners and the GPC and everybody else, and Emiratis and Saudis, and everyone wanted to push the Houthis out of Hodeidah in the Red Sea.
Yeah.
The reasons for that is a lot of smuggling came from the ports of Hodeidah. Also, humanitarian goods were coming from Hodeidah, where the Houthis were taking it and redistributing those to their partners and friends, and deepening the suffering in Yemen's crisis. But the international community thought that if Hodeidah falls, then and the port is affected, then it will cause famine in Yemen.
Mm.
So that was eventually that was stopped. The battle started and then stopped, and a Stockholm agreement was brokered in Sweden, and in which um, in which it was seen as an agreement that saved the Houthis and allowed them to deepen their control. What happened is that the Houthis amassed all force and weapons and got all the assistance that they wanted from Iran. When the battle for Hodeidah stopped, they just redistributed all their resources to other parts. So they were able to start the war in Al Jawf and Ma'rib, two critical areas that were a safe haven for Houthi opposers. Al Jawf effectively fell after it had been liberated and now is with them. And Ma'rib saw just a humanitarian catastrophe that, no one did not really take the same amount of attention
Mm.
that the world has given to the Saudi intervention in Yemen. And it's kind of frustrating because when you try to talk about it or write about it, the attitude is like, this is not a war that we started, so it's just between the Houthis and the government. But when it's the Saudi intervention,
Yeah.
we feel compelled to talk about it because of the um, assistance that we're giving Saudi Arabia in terms of armament. And I think,
Let's turn to that for a second if we can, because I think it's even more complex, sadly, than you're just starting to get the tip of the iceberg. If you can tell us a little bit, I understand the UAE has been supporting a separatist group, and then also you're starting to talk about U.S. involvement. How is the U.S. involved here, and
And
what are
why?
U.S. motives here?
Yeah. What are our interests? Yeah.
well, initially we were selling weapons, right,
Mm.
to the Saudis, and that's in our economic interest. And currently, we're playing a really proactive role with having the U.S. envoy to Yemen, Tim Linderking, who is attempting to mediate. And I think it's a limited role because we don't have any leverage among the Houthis, but we do have leverage with the Saudis. So we were able to guide the Saudis in a way that have reduced from the humanitarian catastrophe and calamity that we saw at the beginning of the war. And it's unfortunate because the aberrant airstrikes that happened and the loss of life has delegitimized the Saudi role. So even though that they've liberated here and there, the optics did not look good ultimately,
Mhm.
and the cost was too high for
Mhm.
Yemenis and I think Saudis alike, whom I mean. To a certain reason, it kind of like I mean, during that time, it almost became a pariah state. Things have shifted. Now we don't see Saudi Arabia in the same way because we're learning a lesson, seeing the Red Sea attacks that the Houthis are preventing. And again, with things shifting again, Saudi Arabia is saying, we're not going to interfere. This is the wrong time to interfere. It's going to produce a loss of life. So again, and I think if there's any lesson to be learned is the fact that we could understand the region, but we don't know how to play well in the region. We don't know how to play well with the actors in the region. And so the United States is interested in maintaining stability. And I think it lacks strategy in terms of really getting members of the regions to have trust like in the United States because right now you're really leaving the region open to the influence of Russia and China and Iran in that matter because Iran did strike um, temporary pact or peace treaty. I can't exactly remember the words, but with Saudi Arabia, there was some kind of a agreement with Saudi Arabia, and that translated to also de-escalating with the Houthis. And for the past couple of years, there has been no airstrikes, there has been no border skirmishes. The Saudis have been somewhat happy. The Saudis also paid a high cost in supporting Yemeni factions, different factions that were not able to really change the situation. So I think the Saudis accepted the status quo. Iran, because of the Islamic Republic of Iran, because of the unrest that happened with
Yeah.
Mahsa Amini's brutal killing, and then the revolution that's happening in Iran, immediately sought to de-escalate because it did not want to stretch itself too thin everywhere, like domestically and regionally. So striking that pact has been helpful. It's been helpful for the Saudis to catch their breath too, but we don't know what's next. So currently, with the conflict in Gaza, the Houthis are playing this role that's bringing everyone to talk about them. They're playing this role that in a sense, it's been again with things shifting. Like you could see even some opposition members in Yemen saying, "Oh, okay, they're probably doing the right thing." Standing
Mhm.
up against, uh, um, the humanitarian calamity in Gaza, when in fact all they're doing is activating themselves as an axis of resistance member. I don't think that they really care much about what's happening in Palestine. They just care about it's all a messaging and a propaganda stunt for them.
And a
Uh,
power play,
Infrastructure.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
and sorry, yes,
And
yes, it's a
yeah.
it's a it's a power play. So you talked about, but Joel asked me, I think, about the Presidential Leadership Council and where Yemen is today. So uh, remember we talked about President Hadi, that he was a consensus candidate in 2012. He was a vice president who all the parties chose him as the president of Yemen. And in 2022, seeing the stalemate that Yemen was at, the Saudis wanted to shake things up and kind of respond to everyone. It's not just a stalemate, but also a threat of secession from the Southern Transitional Council, who felt that. I mean, they've long talked about separating as a state, so they've had their own president. Um, so to diffuse the situation, I think something good happened, although it doesn't have a lot of power. But the Presidential Leadership Council came to the fore, and it had eight leaders so 4 from the north and four from the south to kind of have a balance of power and address that lack of distribution of political power.
But the
Uh,
Houthis were not included in that, correct? Was
they
there
were
Houthi
invited.
representative?
They were invited to
Hmm.
be part of it, and of
Hmm.
course they rejected.
Okay,
So the PLC basically just took over the powers from Abdurrabbu Mansour
got it.
Hadi, and the formation was really a significant shift. It may not have done much. It doesn't have political power, cannot stabilize the economy.
Hmm.
It gives access to power that Yemenis often complain about. The core problems of Yemen is lack of public services,
Yeah,
like equal public services, and
yeah,
also equal distribution of political
yeah.
power. I mean, I think these are the two main fundamental problems in Yemen. So the PLC is there, and that's what the international community and the Saudis and the Emiratis are supporting at the
Now,
moment.
on lack of public services, though, that's an enormous problem, isn't it? Because we're talking lack of food, lack of water, or cholera outbreaks, discussions of famine across the country. It just affects an enormous number of people, doesn't it?
Yes, and Yemen is a poor country. So back when like when I started working with DFID, I was working in the international assistance front with the British government, and there's just nothing. I
Yeah,
think back in 2007 or six, if I remember, uh, uh, ch- the entire GDP, and it was like the entire country's budget was $6 billion. There are
yeah,
some universities that like have
yeah,
more, like three
yeah,
times more than that in the US. So it's a country right now, like it's about 30 million, 25 to 30 million people roughly. It's big, it's vast, and a lot of the communities up in the north live in small scattered villages. You cannot provide services everywhere, so it is a challenge. um, uh, Water is a scarce resource in Yemen, and because of global warming. So we've been seeing really an effect in that area. Humanitarian assistance by itself cannot save Yemen. And during the conflict, even at its highest, we were talking about the importance of really finding avenues to look into long-term solutions. But like one of the biggest long-term solution that we can have right now is electricity in the south of Yemen.
yeah.
It gets so hot, and there's just not enough electricity and power generation. The last I left it, like before I left Yemen in 2008 or 9, we were discussing a project to be funded by the European Union and others, and the European Union wanted, and actually, I'd admit the mistake I've made. They wanted to have a big power project that would address that, because ultimately it would help also the industry stabilize.
Yeah.
But the short-sightedness of the international community, which I was a part of, kind of advocated for more immediate solutions in health and nutrition, and looking at stabilizing nutrition, and it was just a band-aid when you could have
Yeah,
had something big.
It's all important, but most of us neglect the importance of electricity.
yeah,
And most people in the poverty-stricken world don't have it to start, don't have a constant source of electricity. But then you add conflict for a decade plus on top of that, and
devastating.
it makes it incredibly
Yeah,
worse. So you can't
Right.
do
yeah,
anything without electricity, from industry to just refrigeration and medicine and things like that. So no, that's a good you brought that up. That's incredibly hard. I do want to jump back, and maybe Joel have one final question, but I do
yeah,
want
yeah,
to jump back and ask you about the Red Sea attacks, because that's
yeah,
been in the news a lot. And that's one of those things that we hear about, and it's like, okay, another missile attack is happening. What is happening inside of Yemen? Why are these attacks happening? What are the group dynamics of these attacks happening? Can they be stopped? What's going on there?
The Houthis have been disrupting, and they're just major disruptors. That's their entire function. That's their entire use for the Islamic Republic of Iran, and they're basically their use their 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 use of these attacks is really tactical. So at and what they're doing is, as we're failing to help limit the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, we're just seeing thousands of people dying. They're taking advantage of that, and they're saying because the big powers to be are not doing anything, then we are going to stop these attacks by blocking any aid that goes to Israel. It's not going to happen through our waters. We patrol these waters. And they're doing this for multiple reasons. One of them is they want to show um, um, to the people that they control that not only can they control the situation domestically, but they can control it regionally and internationally. That's a strong message to say, don't
Yeah.
even think about revolting, because we are we're here and no one is challenging us. And the second is, they also are activated by the Islamic Republic of Iran. So they're saying we're fulfilling our role, we're fulfilling our promises. We are going to take the burden and do this. And they're actually relatively in a safe position to do so, because any type of retaliation on the Houthis. I mean, who are the Houthis? They're just
Yeah.
like few members
Hmm.
controlling an entire country. So any retaliation that could wrong would also play into their hands. So when the United States struck the Houthi targets, I mean, the U.S. did not even strike at Yemen or the Houthis. It was just Houthi military capabilities. Houthis took that as a rallying cry, saying, look, finally, the Zionists are attacking us. Let's defend our faith. And they've just twisted things around where
Yeah.
right now they're recruiting people, enforcing recruitment, going door to door. The situation is at its worst right now in Yemen because of that. So uh, every situation, everything that you see is really a calculated plan to shore up their power, their regional standing, and also get sympathy. And it's really unfortunate, but you do see people on social media platforms, on TikToks and others, seeing the Houthis as, I mean, Americans see the Houthis,
Hmm.
seeing the Houthis as freedom fighters. Um, so the messages are getting too confused. Some Yemeni people are even thinking, well, maybe if the U.S. intervened more forcefully, then the Houthis wouldn't have done that. But this argument can turn on its head quite.
For sure. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, it could
Yes,
get worse with more intervention. Yeah.
Right. Right.
and you mean worse with Houthis intervention in exactly? So it could turn over more quickly, and Yemen could be at a worse state than what it is.
Which is kind of hard to imagine in some ways.
And
Right.
it can always get
Yeah.
worse.
It
I
can
can
always
tell
get
you
worse.
that. It can always get worse. And the Houthis really, as they are, they have no agency in Yemen, so they are trying as best as they can to get that agency, and it's an easier. Um, it's just easy for them to throw all of the problems on the U.S. and Israel and say, and get that legitimacy from there, because it's just a simple message. We are against foreign intervention in the region.
Yeah.
Iranian intervention is fine. It's not That's not foreign enough for them,
Right.
but Saudi intervention is wrong,
Yeah. Yeah.
and others is wrong. So it's what they're essentially doing is making sure that they are the only powers be in the region in order for them to control it and ultimately reduce and push out the U.S. role and hegemony over the region, or perceived hegemony over the region. So, and it seems like us the in the West and in the United States, we're also perfectly happy to give up that role. Um, Say that that's fine. We're just gonna look at Israel and Palestine and nothing else.
Yeah.
And everyone else can sort things out. And if it becomes if it becomes necessary, then we'll just intervene when it becomes
At
necessary.
the very least, Israel and Palestine suck all the air out of the room, and there's
Yeah,
no talking about anything else. Yeah.
yeah,
It's a I mean, I just have no words for what's happening over there. I have no
yeah.
words.
Well, if I may, I think I'd like to wrap this up with two questions, and I don't know if they're separate or related, but I've been struck through all of your comments or many of your comments over the last hour, um, about your emphasis on the regionality within Yemen. Is there, so the first question is, do you foresee a risk or a danger, or would it be beneficial if South and North were to split again? That's part A. And then part B comes back to my first question, which I'm not at all surprised. It's such a complex, cross-cutting and shifting set of alliances and groups. But I am struck that it has not been obvious to me anyway that you see um, a preferred option or future. Like, who would, if you could snap your fingers and and change the world so that one of these entities emerged as the dominant force in Yemen, who would that be? Again, I'm looking for the good guys, which is too simplistic. Um, but I have been struck that it has not sounded to me anyway that you have an allegiance or a support any one of these entities in particular as being positive for the future of Yemen.
Um, I think these are two important questions. And especially, we're trying to see a path forward, and
Yeah,
we owe it to Yemenis to find a path forward. And I think the current language, which is it just has not been beneficial. Things like um, an inclusive political process is bullocks when you have entities like the Houthis, who are
yeah,
just have blind allegiance to Iran, and not only affected the political fabric, but the social fabric and the
yeah,
tradition of Yemen. Um, Yemenis are proud people, proud tribesmen, proud, just proud. And now they're afraid. They live in fear of this group. So accountability for this group is really important, but it's very difficult to hold them accountable when
yeah,
just it's like what constitutes a Houthi from a non-Houthi, really. It just becomes really, really difficult. So what I emphasize on is the leadership. The leadership needs to be you need to cut their tentacles that are spreading everywhere, and that's really important. Other than that, all groups need to find a way to carve their path, whatever that may be. Um, on the I like the formation of the PLC. The theory of it is great. Whether it works or not is a totally different issue. I can't imagine that they're all holding, great conversation among themselves. They have deep ideological differences, including with the Southern Transitional Council. And one thing I'm aware of, and I speak of often, but when we talk, the difference between the North and the South is huge in terms of political ambition. Northern people, and I think it's in their DNA, they're expansionist. So the North will want to expand. They'll want to take power. They'll want to take land. The Southerners are exclusionist. They want their own things to be the way they are. They don't want to. It's the idea of just leave me alone, please. They're avoidant. They don't want the conflict. They want to avoid it.
yeah,
Avoid it.
yeah,
Both are different histories and different trajectories. The North feels that they have they're great in politics. Well, the South are great technocrats, and they feel like they need to be protected, and that they can't really do well in a system of alliance between the North and South. And I've heard all sorts of possible scenarios that I just don't want to confuse you or your audience with. But it is a probability. Like, I mean, I remember, I fear that if there's something like secession, you would see an unusual alliance between Houthi adversaries and the Houthis in order to claim land in the south, in order to keep that union from breaking. So I don't know what the right answer is, and a referendum and respecting of people's voice is the most important thing in a process. So people need to stop living in fear, and I feel that a formation like the PLC is the closest thing possible to some kind of an equilibrium. PLC allowed people to understand that the I mean, it allowed even a lot of the Southerners to understand that now that they are in power, they still have the same problems.
Yeah.
The electricity is not working.
Yeah.
Their rights are still not given. They still have insecurity, and I think that allowed for that to happen. And I think in some ways the conflict have brought people a little bit closer to each other. What I could have told you um, 15 years ago, secession was on the door. Like, it was inevitable. There was an overriding feeling for Southern identity, but now I feel like the Southern identity has been achieved. They feel it. Then is there a need for conflict? Is there a need to actually secede, or maybe more of a political settlement can happen? Because a lot of Northerners have been living in the South because it's been one of the most critical areas. So can
Yeah.
you actually fight with your brothers and sisters? It's a so maybe I'm being too idealistic here. And I haven't been in Yemen in a long time to actually, kind of weigh on what that feels like. So I would say just respecting of the individual voice of people's voices, and their destinies, how they want them to be, is really important. And really holding accountable the major perpetrators, which has been the Houthi leadership throughout this.
Yeah.
I think that's something that a lot of the current powers would agree to.
It does strike me that what you describe is, um, in some ways, it might be the least likely, but it's the most obvious and maybe the only path towards a peaceful future in a situation like this, which is some sort of consociational arrangement where the various entities have a role, and that's what you describe in the PLC. Brian, a tip of the hat to you. It's sort of a coming together kind of a future, um, which is always the path to long term security. So. Uh, well, Fatima, thank you so much for joining us. I,
Thank you for
I
having
feel
me.
like I learned a lot, and I know that I did because I've emerged, I think, more confused than I was
Right.
even at the
I
beginning.
was going to say, you provided an
I had
enormous
spinning.
amount of information, and now it's more complex than it was
Yes.
before.
This
So
is
thank you very much.
You're welcome. It's been
Really
Thank you.
appreciate it.
a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And thank you to our producer, Andy Miles, for putting this together. And hope to see you all again at the next episode of the World Discord podcast. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.